Well, hello and good afternoon. Welcome. My name is Fiona Miller. I'm an Associate Professor of Health Policy here at the Institute of Health Policy Management and Evaluation. And I'm very pleased to welcome you here and to welcome our honoured guest,
Thank you.
Simon Denegri from the UK, who, as you know, is the National Director for Public Participation and Engagement in Research for the National Institute of Health Research, and also the chair of Involve, which is the national advisory group to try and promote and support public involvement in the research that's funded by the UK's National Institute of Health Research. And I want to thank Simon very much for taking time out of his extremely busy schedule, including involvement in a dialogue this morning, to engage with us in this quite intimate setting in a discussion and debate about these very important issues. But before I let him start, let me make a very important set of thanks to Dr. Vasanthi Srinivasan, the founding executive director of the Ontario SPOR Support Unit. So that's the unit set up to advance the strategy for patient-oriented research. And it's thanks to Dr. Srinivasan that Simon is able to be with us today, and she gave us the opportunity to host this discussion. And finally, the final point I'll make is that this is the first of a series of seminars that we'll be doing that take up these important issues about how to build an advanced patient-oriented health research and innovation. And very much thanks to the OSSU again, and that's HPME in partnership with the McMaster Health Forum and the Clinical Epidemiology Program at the Ottawa Health Research Institute. So without further ado, I'll turn it over to Simon, and thank you for starting.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Fiona, and good afternoon, everybody. It's wonderful to be with you. I've got a sense, just by the atmosphere in the room, that this is probably going to be the most fun part of the week for me. So it's great to be able to come and talk to you about public involvement or public engagement, as you call it, and we'll come back to that issue of definitions in a minute. So I thought we would run this as a little bit of more of a seminar than a presentation. So I'm actually going to use the flip chart rather a lot. You're going to learn very quickly that I'm not very good at drawing. That's one thing you'll learn. But if at the end of it you think, oh, that's a load of rubbish, you do have some PowerPoint slides, I think, from my presentation at CAHO last week, which you can fall back on and say, well, actually, sometimes you just talk sense sometimes. So anyway, but I thought we'd try and run this more as a discussion than anything else. What I do want to try and do is give you a sense of what our parameters in the UK are when we talk about public engagement, why we do it, why we think it's important, and we might have a discussion in a room about the whys. Our approach at the National Institute for Health Research, which is my employer, because it's quite a particular approach. It's certainly not prevalent, although people are becoming more interested in it. And then some of the impacts it has on process, the process of doing research, and then some thoughts about some future agenda items. Does that sound helpful and interesting to you? Just a little bit more textual stuff on my role. So Fiona quite rightly read out my formal titles. But to give us some sense of what that actually means. So if my boss was here, my boss is the Chief Medical Officer in the United Kingdom, so she's the one who appoints me. If she were here, she often calls me the mini czar. I don't know why she calls me the mini czar as opposed to the full czar, but there must be something in that somewhere. I must ask her about that. But a czar is a term that we use quite a lot for positions that are appointed by government, often by ministers, but not exclusively by ministers. And so they are almost the ministers without portfolios. So they have a wide roaming role. So I have license to roam across the NIHR and across the health research system to promote and advance this agenda called public involvement. And we might come to some of the challenges of that, but one of the challenges when you are a czar, quite apart from that history will tell you most czars end with a very sticky end at some point, although I've managed to stop that from happening so far, is that you have a huge amount of potential influence and responsibility, but the degree to which you have your hand on resources is very small indeed. So you have to do everything by collaborative working, and a huge amount of persuasion and influence, and that can be very tricky, particularly in a time of austerity. But you might want to ask me some of the policy aspects of that and what it's like working in that role within a government department, health department. I thought we might just start off with some definitions, because this is quite crucial. So you have the term public engagement, but we have the term public involvement. So let me just talk about, so the first very bad drawing is going to be my definition pi. So we have three terms that are quite common in our parlance across the health research system when we talk about our relationship with patients and the public. And I'll come back to that point in a minute. So the first is a fairly easy one, which is P for participation. So that's one aspect of the relationship, and that's a really straightforward one of people taking part in research. So taking part in a clinical trial, for instance. What science might have called once a research subject, what we now try and call, more and more encourage the research system to call research partners. So participation, that actual participation in a research study or trial. We then have involvement. So public involvement, the way we define that is the active involvement in patients and the public in terms of the decision making around research. So it's the democratization of what we would define as the research process. So making it more democratic, from setting research priorities, helping to design research down to its dissemination. So really the key words are active involvement, it's about partnership, it's about collaboration, it's about equality. If you want to go that far, we might come back to concepts of equity and equality in health research. So involvement, and then we have engagement. So for us, so I think when you talk about engagement, you're sort of orientating yourselves around the involvement bit. It's my impression from my visits to Canada. When we talk about engagement, we talk about it as a much more straightforward two-way dialogue between science and society. Now, of course, what has happened in the past in the way that science has interpreted that is it's broadcast. It's always been on broadcast mode. So what we would say from a patient and public perspective is that engagement is around actually having that two-way dialogue, because it's through that dialogue you raise not just awareness, but you actually raise better understanding. What scientists once used to call, and still do to some extent, scientific literacy, which is a term I absolutely despise, but it's out there. So engagement is the third bit. Now the reason why it is bigger is because there is a bigger amount of activity, even in the UK, around this very straightforward engagement bit. And there's a lot of tensions between these two. So you'll find that there's a lot of political debate about how people are using definitions. There's a lot of puritanical, advocates around, involvement is the only thing. I have a much more pragmatic approach, which is that these things, pi, should be complementing one another, and certainly should be doing no harm to one another. And if in the perfect world, you're getting a sort of a really good rebound effect from one to the other. But we tend to use involvement and talk about involvement when it's about ways that we involve the public improving decision making. We also try to talk about the public as opposed to patients and the public, although you'll hear me talk about patients and the public an awful lot, just because, again, that's out there as a colloquialism. But very early in the history of the public involvement movement, we took the decision after a lot of debate that public was a broad church definition, which is inclusive of patients, public, service users, carers, the whole range of definitions you might come up. And actually it's easier to use a broad church definition. It's also easier actually when you come to do simple things like write about public involvement, to have something that's easier to use. So we tend to talk about public involvement. I think we're really well aware of all the pitfalls of that approach, and it's certainly not uncontested in the United Kingdom. There's a lot of debate that remains about it, but that's the one we've tended to run with, and I don't think it's going to change anytime soon. But so I think it's quite important for you to know our parameters, our definitions. And what I always say to people when they're setting off on the route of public involvment is, to some extent, I don't really mind what you use, but use it, be clear about why you're using it, and then stick to it, because consistency is one of the real problems in this area, is that people don't use their terminology and definitions consistently. So I thought it might just be helpful to start off with that definitions piece. So I thought I might just ask you a question. I don't know how many of you have got some experience of public involvement, but I wanted to ask why you think we might do public involvement. So what do you think are the reasons that we might do it?
To improve the quality of healthcare.
Okay, quality. Yep.
You might ask a different set of questions that are more relevant to the patient population.
Yeah. Yeah.
Usually allocate resources that are limited
Uh-huh.
because of savings.
Yeah. Come on, let's go for 5.
No changes can be done without public involvement. No changes can be done if we don't have any engagement and involvement.
Okay. So almost like a public support thing?
Yes.
Okay.
Maybe to improve health literacy or self-management
Okay.
of patients.
Yeah. Okay. Did you have your hand up at the end? Lady in, yeah.
Me?
Yeah.
I didn't, but
Oh.
I could offer one.
Go for it. Come on. I picked on you now.
It was related to the allocation of resources. If you're working in a public payer system, so it's public dollars, you want to make sure that the public feels that they're getting value for what they're paying for.
Okay. So value, including pounds.
Look, I've got an
Including dollars.
underline.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so that's really interesting. So there are many, many reasons that are put forward for why you should do public involvement. And they are all very valid. And they all have their validity in terms of how they drive public involvement. But it's quite interesting to look back on public involvement as a movement. So if you go back to its origins, particularly in mental health, HIV, in the 80s, you get a little bit of an essence of this if you've seen the film Dallas Buyers Club. There's a much bigger component at the beginning, which is traditional advocacy, challenging the system, challenging a closed system, sort of a let us in type thing, trying to break open untransparent and unopen societies or organisations. So I think it's quite important when you think about public involvement that you embrace that notion that it is about embracing challenge. That's one of the most difficult things, I think, to get people to accept in institutions like this one or the one that I work in, that it is about accepting you are going to be challenged very fiercely, and it's about finding and creating a space in which that happens. It's not about doing it just to give yourself legitimacy by saying we've got a proportion of the public in this room with us that makes us legitimate. So it is about embracing challenge, and that protest element is really quite important, and we mustn't forget it because it's part of our origins. But if you go to, I do a lot of local meetings, I go out to meetings in London and the north of England, and there is that very strong emotive pull that people have, and to some extent really some difficult issues that they're trying to put on the table.
So actually this raises a point that I actually get concerned about in the patient involvement and engagement is
Yep.
the advocacy aspect as opposed to the representation of what might be more normalized issues or concerns, and so in engaging patients in my research, I tend to actually quite avoid groups that I think are advocacy groups and try to engage the. Just wonder what you might think of that.
So I think that's a great question, and I think and we were talking about this before coming into the seminar room. So I think that is a real issue, and it's a difficult one to manage. But for me, it's about making sure that in that space that you create for your involvement, you're making sure that you get balance. So I think the advocate has every right to be in that room with you, but it's making sure that they may not be the only voice. And that's when you have a problem, when you're only getting one voice or a mainstream voice that's in that genre. That's one of the most difficult things I think about public involvement, is that reach, ensuring that you've got a variety of voices that are being heard. So I think it's absolutely right. And there's some probably practical techniques that I might come back to how you do that. But I can understand why you take that approach. So it's quite important to remember the origins, but it's interesting to me that no one talked about knowledge. So, and I think this is probably, if you were with a group of people who have been in public involvement for a long time in the UK, they would say this is the Rubicon that still's got to be crossed. It's not that some of these things are not happening, they are, and that's great, but I think it's the one that people want to get to is an essential underlying respect for the fact that patient knowledge and experience is as of equal value when you do science as all the other things around the table, whether it be measurement or statistics or methodology or asking questions. So for a lot of people it's about going again back to the origins of public involvement. It's that underlying respect for knowledge acquired through experience, which is still not there within and across the health research system, and still the thing that I think we're struggling to do, even in the NIHR and even after 10 years. The other thing I would say, looking back at our history, is that if I think about the whys, this research continues to be quite an apolitical area. So I don't know what it's like here, but in the UK, there's no political difference between the parties about how to run and do science or fund it. There's just no debate really. There might be big debate about how you look at impact, for instance, but it isn't. You don't crop it in a general election. It's an issue. All those sorts of things. So in one way, that's given us quite a lot of space to do things here that you wouldn't if we were talking about public involvement in our care sector, which is a highly politicised environment actually, and much more difficult to do this work. So that's helped. But I have noticed, particularly in the last 3 or 4 years, that there is a much stronger political driver behind this agenda. And that means that the sort of fairly civilised, cultured way we've taken to develop this is now under a lot of pressure, because politicians want results quickly and they want simple results quickly. And actually this work takes a long, long time to nurture. So, as I say, we've been going at it a decade, and it's very variable how it's bedded in across the system. So it's still not a political with a big P area, but there is greater political injection behind it, and that's going to cause, I think, us a lot of tensions between how we develop it in future years. So why? Let me talk a little bit about NIHR. So NIHR, that's, oh, okay, yeah. Well, if someone can help me do that, that'd be great. Thank you, Anna. Do you mind? Is that all right? Thank you. So, National Institute for Health Research, I suppose your equivalent is CIHR here, but it's quite important to sort of reflect on the NIHR model. So, it's a funder of over £1 billion, so I'll let you work that out in your exchange rate. I can't, because my brain's a bit jet lagged. So it's probably the major government funder in the UK. And we often talk about funding in the UK as being a three-legged stool. So you've got government, you've got industry, and you've got charities. So government's around 1.52 billion total going into health research. Industry's about 4.5 billion, and charities are about 1.3 billion. And the whole thing is that they are supposed to work in a complementary fashion. If you reduce funding from one, you start to tip over the stool. I'm sure you have the same arguments and debates here. But it's NIHR is a sort of distributed organisation. There's a tiny central core of about 30 people who run NIHR. The rest of it is institutes, facilities, projects and programmes that are distributed throughout England. So it didn't start like that. It started as a much more small organisation with only 1 or 2 programmes and perhaps limited capability and capacity. But it's evolved organically over time. And so one of the issues for NIHR is how to keep a very cohesive approach to this without having a very strong central structure. Why do we not want a strong central structure? Because then we become more visible to government ministers, and we then become much more visible to a minister who wishes to put a red line through our budget. So NIHR doesn't even exist as a legal entity. It's sort of a between the lines organisation, which is quite an interesting thing to go away and think about, and deliberately so. And again, going back to some of the stuff I've talked about, this being an apolitical area, it's about actually giving yourselves greater room for manoeuvre across the political environment to build what you want. So hardly anything that NIHR has done in the past 10 years has actually been enacted by primary legislation. It's all been by policy influence and persuasion and working with the scientific community and other communities. So quite an interesting area for anybody who wants to write a paper about how these things create. So I think one of the reasons why NIHR has been successful at public involvement thus far is that when it started off on creating this distributed family, what we call now one NIHR, is it started off with a very strong core principle. Some of you may have heard me talk about this at CAHO last week, that we would do public involvement. So, so there was no policy driver behind this. There was no legislation behind this. This is really informed by people's personal experience. So the top 2 people at NIHR, the Chief Medical Officer and her deputy, both were devout exponents of public involvement because of their personal experience. And that, I think, really drove, plus a very strong patient lobby, that we should have a core principle around public involvement in NIHR when it was set up. And I think if you go back to the beginning documents, you'll find it's a very sort of bold statement about public involvement. All it says is we will involve the public in every aspect of the research cycle. Nothing more than that. Not some grand ambition, not some grand statement about getting 5 million people in trials, but it was a very sort of almost mechanistic, process focused statement. But I think what it gave was a very strong lever for us to continue to go back to and say, have we really begun to meet this challenge that was in the original document? So I think it's a bit like any culture change. You have to have some really strong principles that you start off with. And the second thing is you need to have leadership. And that's another key point behind what I was saying about Sally Davis, the Chief Medical Officer, and others. It was led from the top. So there was, I cannot tell you how much opposition there was to this being in the original document and this being our approach. But I think the fact that it came from the top and from quite a formidable leader and also from our strategy board, I think helped us remove those obstacles, particularly from senior scientists of a particular generation who didn't see any value in doing public involvement whatsoever. So I think that was a huge leg up for us in beginning to move forward this agenda. So what does it mean in practice for the people that we work with? So again, I think this is a really key policy learning for me in terms of doing these sort of culture changes, is to have grand ambitions but to start in a very focused way. So the place that we started in doing this, it was 2 places we really started, but one of those was purely in terms of the application form of how you get money from NIHR. So we started off by asking the question in the application form, how are you going to involve the public? And of course that begins to hopefully trigger a bit of thought and intellectual rigour to within researchers and research teams about what, how are they going to do that in their piece of science. And that now is quite a significant part of the form. We now require a plain English summary as part of the form, and if it's not good enough, people don't get their grant money until it is good enough. It's reviewed by scientists and it's reviewed by lay people. So people are clear about the expectation on them before they even put pen to paper when they apply to NIHR. The second bit is that we have put a lot of work into supporting people to do this. So in the principal way we've done that is through Involve. And as I said last week at CAHO, I think probably this has been one of the greatest determinants of our success over the last 10 years, that we did have a body called Involve that had been established in '96 that was waiting in the wings to be taken under the wing of NIHR, funded properly, so it gets about £800,000 a year to support this activity across an increasingly distributed family. And Involve has been the principal mechanism by which we've supported people. So it has a website, we produce briefings for researchers, we have an evidence library of impact in public involvement. It's done a lot to support patients and the public as well, making sure that they sort of go in with confidence as part of their route. So Involve, I think, has been really, really critical. The problem that we have now, and I'll come back to say how we're trying to address that, is that Involve was a very, very big fish in quite a small sea, once called NIHR. This thing is now huge. So Involve hasn't got, because Involve won't get any more money than it's got now, Involve can't deliver this in the way it could do. So it's now become a very important agency, but in a much bigger distributed system. And in each of the institutions, there are now public involvement leads, there are public involvement units in some places. Almost all our institutions have a patient and public advisory group. So it's quite a complex system of relationships. So I think Involve is moving now to a place where it's going to be responsible for continuous improvement, identifying quality in public involvement. It's also going to be, I think, focusing a lot on a sort of regional network of involved people. But it is going to be one agency, and there's going to be other agencies, I think, that are going to come in the ascendancy to do other things, like think about impact, to think about how do you do public involvement in public health or social care. But anyway, it's been critical, and whenever I go and visit any country, I say, you need some form of organisation for how you do this, because if you don't, it's really, really tricky. It's about sustainability and it's about solidity. So that's a little bit about the history of NIHR. One of the other points I was going to say before moving on to how it actually impacts on the research cycle is that we have been better in, there's no doubt that we have been better in clinical research, thank you, as compared to social care research or public health research. So our strength has been in the clinical research sphere. It's better in social care, are very poor in public health. Yeah.
So that sounds like there's quite a bit of public involvement across a very large. How is that funded? Like, I presume those people are paid.
Yeah. So I was going to come on to funding at the very end. Can I do that? Because I always leave the best questions to last. The other bit is that, as I said, NIHR is by far ahead of the game when it comes into other organisations in the UK. So we do an exercise whereby we look at applications that are going before our research ethics committees across the country. And we look at the public involvement component, and then we look at that, and then we look at the funder of that. And so if you look at NIHR applications, about 87% of those will have a very clear public involvement plan. And it's backed up with, they will say they've got a plan and it's backed up by our review. If you look at charities, medical research charities, we might have a whole debate about medical research charities and the corporatisation of the patient voice. But it's about 46%, I think. But that's better than it was 2-3 years ago when it was in the mid-30s, so it's improving all the time. Industry is around 3 to 5%. Now, so industry is a problem area for us. Challenge. We don't talk about problems. We talk about challenges, don't we? It's a challenge area. To be fair to industry, some of that is a lot of those applications are around phase 1 studies, for instance, where it can be somewhat more tricky to do. But I think even if you took those sorts of things out of the equation, they would be well behind it. And I think they would acknowledge that. But they're under quite a different set of restrictions, not just commercial ones, about how they engage with the citizen. So NIHR performs better than the overall research system. And then if you look at universities, it's probably in the mid-30%. The interesting thing about university sector is, going back to definitions, and this is where some of the tensions can arise and be quite difficult for us, is that they do talk about public engagement. And most of their drive is around the sort of dialogue sphere. It's about improving the notion, particularly in their immediate community, that they are a good corporate citizen in that local community, and it's about raising the profile of their great science that they do, and it's less about involvement. So there's an ideological difference there between us and I think universities. And in fact, the title that I chose for the seminar, so why is research better with public involvement, is actually I stole it from a university tagline, which is Manchester University's, which is why the world works better with us, which I thought was a really great unevidence-based statement by university. And I thought, well, if they can do that, then public involvement can do that too. So, so there are some interesting differences between the overall university sector and us. So let's take the research cycle for 10 minutes if we can. Is this helpful to you? So I'm going to take the research, well, Simon Denegri's version of the research cycle, and sort of talk a little bit about their specific differences that public involvement make. So let's start off with the first bit, which is prioritisation and asking the right research question. So when we did our strategic review last year of public involvement across the NIHR, I think this is probably the area where we felt, where people came back to us and said they felt there had been most change and difference made as a result of public involvement. So to give you some instances of that, one is that we have something in the UK called the James Lind Alliance Priority Setting Partnerships, which some of you may have heard. They were started in 2006. The first one was done in asthma. And in essence, it's a way of bringing together patient and caregiver and clinical and increasingly other health professional opinion to bear on what are the most important research questions. They articulate them as treatment uncertainties that should be asked or addressed in that particular condition. So researchers are not part of this process. It's purely a process involving those constituents. And it starts off quite often with a survey or an online exercise, and then collapses down into a series of workshops with the aim at the end of getting 10 what they call treatment uncertainties. Sometimes it's 11, sometimes it's 12, but more or less 10 or 11 treatment uncertainties. So quite a robust methodology now for what we call research prioritisation. Now, we've done 26 of those. And there's probably another 26 on the go at the moment, rather oddly, but there are. And they range from everything from asthma in the beginning to asbestos-related diseases to rare diseases to the two biggest ones that I often cite are Parkinson's and depression. I think there's going to be one on bipolar disorder very shortly. Some of the ones now, in the beginning, they were quite smallish exercises, so maybe the constituency that were reached with them a couple of hundred people. Now, the Parkinson's and the depression ones, the original pool of people reached who responded to the survey is in the thousands. So I think Parkinson's was about 4,000 people. I think depression is bigger than that. So they're getting quite large exercises. Although the workshop that actually comes down to refining it is obviously quite a small, contained process. So that's one element. The other element is that in our research networks, although this has changed a bit and caused an awful lot of controversy actually in public involvement, we had a lot of what we call clinical studies groups. So these were places where actually researchers and patients and caregivers would come together to sort of set the agenda in that particular clinical area, including drafting and thinking about research questions. So we feel as though there's been quite a lot of engagement and quite a lot of difference made. The difference, I think, is giving greater clarity and transparency and visibility to what matters to patients and the public when it comes to the things that research should fund and take forward. As I was saying to others this morning, the challenge is we've got what? Let's, for argument's sake, we've got 300 treatment uncertainties out there now that have been funded by this. But no one's really done any robust tracking of the degree to which those are being actually picked up by funders. It's not just for NIHR to pick those up, it's for others as well. So I can say as a reviewer that I quite often see the work cited, but that doesn't mean necessarily that that particular question is being picked up robustly. So James Lind, which is just about to have its 10th anniversary, is going to do some work to see what has been picked up and also what does that mean for the future. There's also something about these PSPs, as we call them, which they are sort of skyscraper exercises. So they're quite grand events. A typical one will cost about £60,000–70,000, so double that in your money. The bigger ones are even more. The really big ones are even more than that. And they're great, but they may not be the only thing that we need. We may want smaller sort of town hall exercises, if I can call that a metaphor, and much more iterative ones, because these are sort of a bit of, you do them with your public, then you sort of disseminate them very actively, and then you sort of walk away, and that doesn't seem quite right, doesn't seem quite philosophically the right thing. So that's the first bit. The next one is in terms of design. And again, I would say this is where we've had I think a lot of success with our public involvement, again, primarily through our research networks. So we did have various topic networks, so one in dementia, one in stroke. And we've now actually gone the sort of localized, regionalized route, and we now have 15 local networks. But this is where you will typically have quite a strong patient-public community. So let's just take London, for instance. And they will work alongside funders to look at research protocols and related information and the design of a trial or research study, and influence its modification or improvement based on what the patient experience is. So, I mean, just to take a basic example of that, it may be that the team has defined in the trial that patients should go for blood tests 3 times a week, but this is a group of patients who are severely disabled. So clearly that's an extraordinary, and it happens, it does happen, extraordinary tall order in a place like London with, although good transport connections, not good transport connections if you're severely disabled. So it's about saying to the discussion with the team, therefore, is do you really need to do that 3 times a week? Or can it be 1 time a week, or can it be twice a month? How much do you really need it to be intensive? It may be modification of the patient leaflet. So we have a very active younger persons advisory group, or groups across England. I think about 150 young people, everyone from ages from 7 till 16, 17, I think it is. And in the course of that network operating, they've looked at about 100 patient information leaflets and rewritten those patient information leaflets so they're more suitable for younger age groups. So it's almost, this is almost for me about research readiness. It's about using patient experience to make sure that research is research ready when it hits the ground. And I think we have had a lot of impact there. I think it's not just at the pre-stage as well. When you've got things actually going, we've also found that patient groups sitting alongside a research team or a trial group have actually assisted recruitment. And so that was the next thing I was going to come onto, was actually improving things as they go along. So this has been one of those areas where people have said to us, public involvement is going to slow down the system, it's going to be a barrier, it's going to be a further regulation. And our experience is, nothing could be further from the truth. So when we look at what's happened in our networks, and there's a slide about this in the slide pack, we've actually found that public involvement has improved the efficiency and effectiveness, because it has helped people design better recruitment strategies. It has helped people do better information. So the one that's cited in the slides is from mental health. So our mental health research network looked at something like 340 plus studies on their portfolio over 5 years, and they looked at the association, I stress the association, between those studies' ability to set up what we call time to target, so basically get up and running and recruit in the time that they should do, and the public involvement in them. And they found that there was a strong association between those that were successful in doing that and those that had good, what they called mutuality with the patients. So by that they would define not just people being on a trial steering group, but people designing leaflets, helping with recruitment strategies, helping with dissemination. And they found that those that did have that mutuality were 4 times more likely to hit their time to target goals that are really given them to by government and funders. So quite a compelling story, an exercise that's been repeated across the board, across all the networks in the last 18 months. Not quite with the same compelling, but again with a difference being shown to be made. That's not published yet. Probably I think the smaller difference is, again, it's quite interesting in public involvement. There are certain communities are much more active in public involvement than others. So mental health is an extraordinary, highly motivated, quite radical community, quite engaged in the UK in terms of research, and much more so. If you go to perhaps patients with kidney disease, less so. There are what I would call blind spots across the population where we really struggle to get public involvement going, either because of the nature of the disease, or because of the nature of the population, or all sorts of reasons. So that comes back to some of our issues about reach. So in terms of implementing the research itself, or the methodology and how that beds in, we feel as though we've made a, I don't know whether I spelled that wrong, I haven't got my glasses on. So the next bit is around data analysis. So this is probably a weaker area. I don't think that we've done much here in terms of course, it's quite a difficult area to get public involvement in terms of the analysis. Cochrane do public involvement in terms of their systematic reviews and have demonstrated how it can work very well. But in terms of a particular research project or programme, I think this has been a toughie. I suppose it's about asking the right question of your public involvement at this point, because there's probably a much more vibrant, potentially rich avenue here, which is that whole thing about how to engage and involve patients in the generation of their own data as part of a bigger data pool that can answer the research questions of today and tomorrow. That's the more interesting thing. And if you know patients like me, their work, then that sort of feels in that ballpark. And there's quite a move in the UK to try and create the same sort of ethos. A bit difficult, I would say, because the privacy, the confidentiality concerns of the general public, particularly about their health data, is very, very high. And we're not really attuned to doing this, I don't think. So culturally, I think quite a difficult one. And then the last bit is around...
Can I just add to that, actually?
So, of course.
Yeah, I was just thinking maybe one way of thinking about the data analysis piece is how to present the results in a patient-friendly or public-friendly manner. So presenting it in a way that's most meaningful to them,
Yeah.
that would be probably maybe a good way to engage them.
Yeah, absolutely, which is great. I'm glad you said that, because I was coming on to the champion bit. So it's about getting people to disseminate the results. And of course, we probably all know from our own experience that, in fact, one of the things that defeats the NHS constantly is that you go and ask people what they think of our National Health Service in a survey, and they all think it's the fabulous thing in the world. But they meet someone in the supermarket who tells them about the person who had their wrong leg cut off, and of course, the whole, the viral rumour mill is that the NHS is dire, terrible. And in a similar sort of thing, the best communication around health research findings is peer-to-peer, so patient-to-patient. So we have a really active programme of research champions, people talking about their experience of research, but also talking about what the results mean for the wider community, but also what it actually meant for their own disease experience. So I think you'll find a lot of people who've been through a trial will say, actually, it gave me some sense of control over what was happening. It gave me a purpose to something where actually I felt very completely without control. So I'm really pleased I did that. So there's a sort of psychological benefit from research participation involvement, which is, I think, it's worth bearing in mind and probably needs to be researched much more. So I think in terms of this, very basic mean cycle version of the cycle, I think we can begin to point to differences it's beginning to make. However, I would say that the impact agenda is really, really fraught with difficulty in the UK. So I'm a policymaker, I'm a campaigner by trade, I'm not an academic by any stretch of the imagination. I suppose my frustration, I'm sure this all feels like manna to heaven if you're a researcher in the audience, but my frustration in the UK is we have a lot of people developing evaluation frameworks, which is great. I think that's really important, but no one seems to really like the last one that's produced, so they produce another one. That doesn't help me from a policy point of view. I have to go to ministers and say, this is why you need to be funding this. This is why your research is valid, because the public are part of it. I can't do that with an evaluation framework. I have to do that in a different way. So we have to get this, we have to do both. We have to have those frameworks which help people improve the methodology, improve how they're doing, but we also have to have a bit of a political mindset. So in the review that we've just completed, we've said that there are 3 things that are going to be really important to us over the next 10 years. And we've not really defined in great detail for us yet what each of these means and how we're going to take them forward. But the first is reach. So the extent to which we reach out to the population. So I can tell you that public involvement in the UK is a white and middle class activity, and largely female one. We don't reach out to a diverse population, so we need to do that much more actively. You may have also got a sense from what I've said already that we talk in terms of individuals. So a lot of what we do in the public is about bringing individuals into a system to give it an accountability and legitimacy. So we've got to reach out to communities and neighbourhoods and think about those terms. I think that's probably why our approach has failed a little bit in the public health and the social care sphere. The next thing is about its relevance. So it's about, is it meeting the needs of the population, and is the public involvement helping that? Is it helping the research community, funders, government to reach a point at which they feel as though what they're funding is ever more relevant? It's really important here, I think, that there is no suggestion, certainly not in my mind, that it's about putting it to a democratic vote. It's nothing about that. It's about trying to get a more balanced portfolio of work, and one that feels relevant to the needs of society going forward. And then the last one, I suppose, which is where frameworks do play into it, is refinement. So we have lots of different models that have been applied. We need to refine those. I really do empathise with the researcher who says to me, I don't know what good looks like in this sphere. And we do need to provide some better answers than giving them chapter and verse on what's happened over the last 20 years in public involvement. They need simpler solutions, and that probably is where frameworks could help, frameworks that feel academically robust. So I'm just going to leave you with two final thoughts, and then we can have 10 minutes of questions. If that's all right, Jill. Thank you for doing that for me. So where next? So I think the first one is about, when we did our strategic review, is that we said in 10 years we wanted to get to a point at which public involvement has the same status as accurate measurement in research. So it's just what we do. We don't even think about doing it because it's just part of the psyche of the way that NIHR funds, and it processes things, and it does the methodology. So building on what we've already done to do a much more, I think, seismic culture change. So the second one is co-what. So everything is moving politically, in science as well, to some extent, is about how do we go from involvement, which almost feels like invitation only still, it's by invitation, to one where we're actually co-creating solutions with patients and the public. So there really is equality in the room, their experiences are respected, and we're developing innovations, but also getting public involvement about how we diffuse those. That's another area we haven't probably got time to talk about today, but we're very weak in public involvement in diffusion and implementation throughout the system, which is a perennial issue. And we haven't quite tackled this thing, which is about patient pool. Just to come back to the funding issue, so this is an interesting one. So we have a central bit of funding, which is through Involve, and I said that's about £800,000 a year. Every grant or programme or infrastructure that comes to us for award has to stipulate its public involvement plan, but also how much it's going to put behind that. So that's quite difficult, and we now have a costing template that people can use to do that, and that's available on the Involve website. That's quite interesting because I've seen those budgets get more robust. So one of the boards, one of the institutes that I work with is 10% of its overall budget is for public involvement. So this is what, a £3 million a year project. Yeah. So it's quite a significant portion of its money is now going into public involvement and engagement. So there's what happens within a programme. I think there's also something about, we got for the strategic review, which is public involvement works best when it's really early in the process, and everything sort of spirals from that point. So we have something called a research design service organisation. So across each of our regions, we have a small office with some people in it who help researchers come to them with ideas, begin to refine and design the work. An increasing number of those, and in fact Involve will be working through that organisation much more in the future. But each of those offices, or many of those, will now give people small grants, researchers small grants, to be able to do some public involvement. So typically about $1,000 Canadian they'll use to perhaps establish a small public involvement group, time-limited one, to test the question with them, think about the research design. And of course it helps your application to NIHR if you can say that you've done that. That you've gone to people and you've thought about it beforehand. There was quite a lot of argument, particularly from patients and the public, about the fact that that was too small amount of money to give to them. But most people give quite a lot of money back. And I suppose that's the other thing. It's if I was standing here as a comms person, which is partly my background, this doesn't necessarily have to be a hugely expensive area, but you do have to value it and you do have to invest it. And part of the really significant investment is actually in recognising the time and the effort and the support you need to give to people. So it may not actually be lots in terms of money, but you may have to spend more time in rooms talking to people as part of your generation of your idea, and you may need to spend a lot more of your thinking about how do you support people to be able to contribute at the table. But the benefits, and I would say this, wouldn't I think the benefits, become very apparent quite quickly of what that can mean to the quality of your research. So I'll stop there because I know we're nearly up for time. I hope I haven't gone on too long, but I hope it's been helpful. I'm happy to answer any questions. Thank you. I'll take that one and then.
Or you go first. And
okay, you go first then.
All right, you've had your turn. Thank you very much for that very insightful overview. I wonder if you can comment further on why you think some patient communities have been involved more than others. Is it a resource issue, or their familiarity with research design, or is it a cultural, historical?
Yeah, I think it's. So I would take the view that each disease area has its own, also almost like microculture, a bit like we talk about microclimates. And there are lots of things that go to determine whether that's pro research, but also pro public involvement. So I think in mental health research, which is one where it has been very positive, I think you can't underestimate the degree to which people felt so excluded by the medical model of how they're treated. But I think that was a really strong driver in them actually wanting to change things. And I think that they had a really good cadre of senior researchers who were willing to support them in that and to spearhead it with their colleagues. In another area, you might have the problem will be that you would have a less radicalised, less political patient community in some senses, but it may also be the fact that your funders in that area are not particularly switched on to public involvement. So a lot of our medical research charities actually have their origins in groups of scientists setting them up. So their view has been generally that this is a funding source for my work or our work, not that it's been a source by which to bring people together for a common good. So the public have been excluded from that, and therefore the culture around that particular science hasn't been conducive to public involvement. So I think there are many, many determinants that make up one that's better than another. In some, I think it's just about time and consistently breaking down the barriers. So cancer is probably one of those that's furthest along in some respects, because it's had, 12, 13 years of working around public involvement. Predates even NIHR in public involvement terms in the UK. But even then, the biggest charity, Cancer Research UK, has only just started public engagement in research. It's really been driven by survivor agenda. So people who've survived cancer treatment got together in the late 90s and really started to say, actually, this isn't the way we want to do research anymore. We want to be part of this. So I think there are lots of different things that make one community more proactive or more able to do it than others. It would be an interesting question to ask.
So you mentioned at the beginning around the conceptualizing what was most important, and you talked about knowledge. And I think that's very much the case. But could I ask, it's kind of a two-part question perhaps. One is what type of knowledge? So is it knowledge and sort of expertise in engaging in research in a more generic sense, or is it much more content knowledge about the topic area? So if you're doing renal research, is it about being able to engage well with researchers, or is it knowing a lot about renal care? And depending on that, there might be a difference in the kind of preparation that participants might need to do a good job of engagement.
Yeah. So that's so I was talking about knowledge in terms of people's lived experience with their condition, whatever condition it may be. So, and being able to apply that to help the science. But you fix on a quite interesting one, which is that may be people's starting point. That may be the original ask of them, expectation, but how does that evolve over time? So people who've been doing public involvement for a while also build up knowledge about the science. They also build up knowledge about how things get decided in science. So then you have the question, do they invalidate themselves as a patient because they're moving more and more away from their patient experience? Or are they more valid because they actually know how things work, and how do you support them? And I would say they're all valid, You know, they all have a purpose and a need, and we need to embrace them all. But you may have to have different tactics about how you manage that in the course of what you're trying to do. So you may think at the beginning of a research project, it's better to have a raw voice of people who've got just a lived experience, have no knowledge about the science, because that's what you really want. But further along the line, when you're thinking about perhaps the overall strategy for science in cancer, it may be good to have a combination of all those things. So I think I was originally talking about the lived experience in terms of the knowledge and using that to develop solutions. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, it does. It does. I mean, I think though that I think that sometimes the tables can be very imbalanced in terms of power, and that's where the more patient knowledge is, like not the content knowledge, but knowledge of how to engage becomes very important.
Yeah, and we do a lot to support people, you know, to be able to be able to communicate at the table, and we do a lot to support chairs, for instance, of committees to make sure that, you know, we have, for instance, good practice that you should never have one person, you should always have 2 lay people on a panel or a committee, that the chairs brief, that the chairs sat down with the lay people before a meeting, before their first meeting. So we do quite a lot of intensive, you know, induction work to give them the best chance possible, and they will often be provided with some form of mentor, which, you know, outside of that room that they can talk to and say, oh yes, I don't know whether it's for me, or, you know, this is good or that was bad, or.
So out of time I know, but we can take maybe 2 more questions and then perhaps have the opportunity to chat.
Yeah, sure. Any over here, because I haven't been over here.
Hi, I just had a question about research prioritization.
Yeah.
I'm doing a project using the James Lind Alliance methodology in pediatrics, which has been an interesting experience. And one of my challenges has been just to convince people that this is a worthwhile exercise, especially in funding bodies, because we're not quite at your stage here at Canada yet. So I was wondering if you could speak a little bit more. You mentioned that there were 300 projects that were funded based on these research uncertainties or treatment uncertainties that were identified. So I was wondering if you could speak a little bit more about that, especially in terms of the rationale we can use for this type of project.
So yeah, no, I said there were 300 treatment uncertainties identified, but we don't know to the degree to which they've been funded or taken up by funders. But to go back to your challenge, so I think where I've sold this to some charities and other funders, it's actually, this is a highly strategic manoeuvre by you. So it's about actually setting the agenda in your area of the science. And so if I look at things like breast cancer, some of them have done that. They've taken it as almost their way of saying, this is about identifying the gaps. We can influence the whole of our community by doing this exercise. So moving it, you know, I suppose it's about being, about messaging really, isn't it? About why you're doing exercise, but actually saying, you're going to get a huge amount, not just in terms of what you hear in terms of patient voice, but how you strategically place yourself as an organisation. And it's certainly true to say that those who have done that, people are very focused on the fact that they've done it and actually feel as though they've taken a leadership position. So that's one of the ways I've sold it to funders.
For less prevalent populations, are there organized efforts to kind of ensure that they're not oversampled and there's not the participant burden? So, for instance, in Ontario, with my experience with spinal cord injury, like there's a bit of concern about the population being overstudied or being involved to the extent that, you know, all the researchers are trying to get access to a very small proportion of the population. And do you see that being a problem, or are there ways to kind of mitigate that you're envisioning?
Yeah, I do actually. I think that's a very very good point. So in other talks, I talk about sort of almost a frenzy around public involvement, and people feel so much they have to do it that they sometimes perhaps do it when they don't have to, and that's one of the places we need to get to. Reaching a point where we have a decision tree where we can accept that in some places it's not good, or equally saying, well, why should we need to do it over here because it's already been done? And so I think it's about, that's perhaps a bit of our evolution that we haven't gone through yet, having those sorts of decision trees and sort of quite robust ways of saying, actually, let's just use our common sense here. We're gonna get fatigue in this group if we continue to do this. I think that has to be part of how we evolve. Absolutely, it's a really good point.
And with that, I'll ask you all to join me in thanking.
Thank you.